So now the intercooler is mounted to the car, it's a bit easier to show you some of the other considerations you need to take into account when you're choosing the size of it. So obviously the longer the core is, the more temperature it will be able to remove from the charge, but the higher the pressure drop will be. So for example, you put 10 psi this end, you'll only get 8 psi out that end. So a shorter core, you'd get less of a pressure drop, but it would be less effective at removing heat because obviously the channels are shorter, so the boost doesn't spend as much time in there or have as much surface to rub against to lose its heat and transfer it into the metal of the actual intercooler itself. Some manufacturers, when their cores get longer, they put a less dense fin structure up the inside of it, so that will help to combat the pressure drop. But when they make a shorter one, they sometimes put more dense fins in there, so the pressure drop sometimes isn't a huge factor. But again, you don't really know this unless the intercooler manufacturer tells you the actual number of fins per inch that on their actual coolers. So now it's in place, you can see that the full height of it is exposed to the road air, so that's obviously going to cool it as effectively as it can. If you have a taller core, for example, the top 50mm of that, or maybe the bottom 25mm of that, are going to be covered by the bumper and also by this bar. So if there's no road air blowing through it, it's not really going to do anything. So you'll have boost blowing through the top channels that are completely shrouded from the road air, and you won't get any heat reduction from that. So that's something to bear in mind, is to try and keep all of the core exposed to the cooling air. So the thicker the core gets, the more resistance it has to the air flowing through it trying to cool down the charge. So if you get above a 3-inch thick core, you should start to look at some sort of ducting to go on the front. That would help channel the air through the core rather than letting it sort of hit the front of it and then just basically try and go around the sides, because that's the path of least resistance. So most people recommend a 2-inch to 3-inch core. This is a 2.5-inch. What you've also got to remember is that as the air travels through the core, it gets heated up. So the air traveling through the second half of this core has already been preheated in the first half, and the second half of any intercooler core only does 25% of the work as far as reducing temps goes. So essentially thinner cores are better, but we've also got to take into consideration the thinner the core gets, the taller it needs to be to get the same amount of internal flow path. So the taller an intercooler gets, the more likely it is to be hidden. So in the case where you would end up hiding part of it, it's better to have a shorter, fatter core, because at least all of it is exposed to the cooling air, than to have a thinner core that will allow air through it more efficiently, but a section of it won't even see any air at all. So that's a consideration to make when you're choosing how tall it is versus how deep it is. So alternatively, if you do want to use a thinner core but it'll end up being shrouded, what you can do is add ducting again. This will increase the amount of air flowing through the cooler, including the shrouded channels, which will therefore improve its efficiency. So as you can see from this photograph, other manufacturers have been doing similar things for years for their side mount intercoolers. The other thing to talk about is the construction. Obviously this is a bar and plate design, which is sort of cheap and easy to manufacture. It's pretty strong, nice and robust, but it is quite heavy compared to a tube and fin style. The tube and fin style is obviously lighter, it's sort of an extruded tube, but they're not quite as robust as this, so a pretty heavy stone chip can sometimes puncture them, or you get a few in the wrong place and you will end up with a hole in it, and it's so thin I don't think you can weld them up. Plus they're not as strong in general, and being as this has to be part of the bonnet latch mechanism on this particular build, I'd rather go with a stronger cooler as well. The bar and plate design has more thermal mass, so once they get heat soaked, they can take longer to cool down than the tube and fin equivalent under normal road driving. They had a tube and fin style that was slightly shorter than this, or they had this version here, and this is the one I've gone with, so that's tube and fin. Obviously, the larger the frontal area of the intercooler, the more effective it will be at cooling the charge down. So as thinner cores are more effective, the intercooler needs to increase in height to maintain the same internal flow area. When you increase the height of the core, it will also start to block off more of the radiator. So the radiator will then become less efficient because you're not only reducing the amount of air flowing through it, also you're sending preheated air from this cooler into it as well, and that will put more thermal load on the engine. So I chose a 2.5 inch thick core, which gave me a fairly short height, leaving a good amount of the radiator free to receive cooling air. So that's enough talking about the intercooler. We'll be on to the pipework next, but that's coming up in next week's episode. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon.